Hello, everybody. All right. I am Ben Meader. I want to do. One of these days, I want to do like the Dwight Stone from The Office, where I am Ben. But I'm not going to do that for you guys, so don't worry. So I'm Ben Meader. I work at EMC Insurance. Welcome to my presentation about a new way of measuring your exposure to the sun. No, not really. Not super sun protection factor. This is the strategic security planning framework. And honestly, I've tried really hard to come up with a good acronym. I usually come up with really clever ones, but I just couldn't do it this time. So SSPF it is, and you guys are all going to jump on board. But first, a little bit about me. So I live in West Des Moines with my family. I've got a wife, a daughter, 2 cats. I've been there for 12 years. I am the Technology Security Director at EMC. I oversee identity access management, cybersecurity ops and engineering, and a risk management and consulting team. We've got a really good team doing some really great work, and we happen to have an opening, which I might have referred to a little bit before, for the cybersecurity operations analyst. I've got my MBA from DePaul University in Chicago with a focus on entrepreneurship, and an undergrad from Iowa State in MIS. I love talking risk management and business strategy. Started out in network security and moved on to governance, risk, and compliance, which is actually kind of fun, guys, so don't hit me for that. I've been leading teams in security for about 10 years. I also love startups. I've tried my hand at a couple over the years. I'm currently an advisor to a Techstars security company called Havoc Shield based out of Chicago, and was a mentor this past year at the Global Insurance Accelerator for Cybercade, a security awareness gaming startup. And I absolutely love to write. Telling stories is what led me to start Fish Stories, which is a contest that I run annually at DEF CON. I'm someone who loves to make connections as well between people and concepts. So I've always been excited about finding ways to break down barriers between security and what I'll call the business. Communication and writing has always been my go-to skill. So creating a framework for others to tell their story is why I'm here today. And that's really the problem with most security strategies. You know, a story that isn't understood is a story that no one reads. As security professionals, we usually understand it, but does the business? You know, dropping NIST 853 in front of most CEOs is a recipe for disaster without a primer. And while I may be a director, in my heart, I'm still that super curious kid who went to DEF CON 3, and don't do the math on how long ago that was. Yes, DEF CON 3. Someone did tell me it looked like my soul exited somewhere between these 2 pictures. So I made sure to show the most current one first so that no one thought about that. In all seriousness, though, what I thought about with this framework is, how can I get these 2 guys to understand each other and connect the dots? Like, Executive Ben with old hacker Ben who was 18 years old. Like, how can we get these 2 guys to get together? So for the agenda tonight, we'll dive into why I decided to do this in the first place. Then I'll guide you through an overview of the framework and give you a little bit about why it's something that you should care about, even if you're not a leader. And then we'll talk about next steps. And one caveat here, I'm still in the early stages of kind of getting this thing fully baked, but I felt like it was at a good enough place to share among friends, especially those who had already had a few drinks, and that's why I opted for the second presentation of the night. So the problem. I think the term strategy can be quite nebulous. It means different things to different people. But I could not escape the questions. Multiple people kept asking me, what's our strategy, Ben? We had plans, we got lots of plans in many different places, but tying them all together was really tough. So we do quarterly planning and annual security roadmap planning to work out for the next year. Both are good exercises, but it always felt a little lacking to me. I could tell you what we were doing, but I didn't always have the best answer for why or why now. As an organization, we really shifted how we were talking about our work. It was becoming less about our security needs and security objectives to more about business outcomes, which is good in theory, but connecting the dots between what we want from a security standpoint and what the higher level business goals were didn't always mesh. So I looked around at various security frameworks and came away wanting more. Most of what was security focused is truly security focused. It made me wonder, do we as security professionals really know how the work we do impacts those business outcomes? And maybe more importantly, does the business really understand why we do the work that we're doing? Having a background in building business plans from biz school, I decided to take the approach of a security strategy as a business plan to connect those dots between security needs and business outcomes, and hopefully answer the why for various audiences, from security staff to executive leaders. And thus was born the Strategic Security Planning Framework. So before I get too far into this, I need to give a little bit of credit to Patrick Murphy, who is the Goodrich Entrepreneur Chair at the University of Alabama, Birmingham, and a former professor of mine at DePaul University from MBA. While I knew I wanted to tie a security strategy to a business plan, I didn't want to use the traditional business planning process because I knew it could get a little tedious and a little overburdensome to people. And so he pointed me to a model that he had developed and was a lot more nimble. And I modified that and adapted it to more of a security planning framework. So big props to Patrick. Thank you for starting me off down this path. There's 4 steps to the process, and I'm not going to read through those verbatim. But in simple terms, I'll say environmental scanning is really looking around to see where you are and what you're facing. Strategy formulation is making a plan based on what you found. Strategy implementation is doing the things you planned. And evaluation of control is checking to see whether or not your plan is working and fixing any problems that you might find along the way. Really, the key differentiator of the SSPF is in its approach to integration between information security with a business strategy. Unlike traditional security frameworks that focus primarily on technical controls, SSPF emphasizes aligning security initiatives with your organization's goals and addressing emerging threats to your organization. It works with those traditional frameworks rather than replace them. It started as a business plan and was built with that in mind, but remember, it's a framework. It's not the strategy itself. I'm giving you the guardrails and a few specific items to start with to think about including, but I'm giving you the start to write your own story. The process is hierarchical and serial in nature, and try to say that 5 times fast. I'm glad I only did 1 drink before I started this presentation. Each step has subsections that kind of guide you along the way. Some of those sections get more specific, and others are more flexible. But once you've gone through all 4 phases, you'll start over again. It's a living strategy. Just keep it populated, keep going. So you'll see an example here of just kind of how I've got it set up, but I'm tracking each section and subsection within Confluence, so it's easy to find, modular in design. You can pull out different sections and use those for various purposes as you go on. One example use case, just if anybody's thinking about one, that I think is particularly nice, is it would help a lot with filling out a cybersecurity insurance renewal. A lot of times those are hard to find all the information, and if it's all in one nice spot in a strategy, you can just kind of pull out the section and say, here you go, and fill it out. That said, I use Confluence, but any document management system will do, and every step we take through this process needs to have a slot documented somewhere. So we're going to get started with environmental scanning. So you can't develop a strategy if you don't know why you're here and what you already have. This kicks off the whole process. So there's 2 sections. We've got general and business environments. We'll dive into each one of those over the next few slides. The external scan is broken down into 2 environments as well, general and business. General is, well, just kind of what it says. It's a scan that encompasses broader factors that impact organizations across multiple industries. So this probably applies to most organizations. The business environment, however, is a scan that takes a focused look at the security issues that are facing the industry that your organization might reside in. I did an example here of insurance because EMC is insurance, but whatever industry you might be in, that's the one that you would do there. The external scan really helps solidify what you're facing and kind of why you have a security program. I created it using research, Google, experience, and a little chat GPT. These are designed to be at a very high level, and you can think of them as potential broad level risks that you face as an organization. So now on to the internal scan, and this one gets a little detailed, so apologies up front, but we're going to go through this. Think of this as the internal snapshot of your security program. It considers your current strategy, structure, control, culture, and resources that you currently have at your disposal. We'll step through each one, but I'll pull out a couple of them to really highlight. Think of this as a guide to kind of help you look closely at key parts of your program. Some of the sections are more specific than others, but all are important to understanding the current state of your security program. look for gaps and take notes of those in a checklist. Whether you're completely missing something or maybe something isn't as mature as you'd like it to be, you want to track those as it will inform some work later on in the framework. So the strategy section, which is the first part of the internal scan, is kind of the Cliff Notes version of your current strategy. So you may be starting at ground zero, or maybe you have an established strategy that you simply need to refresh. Either way is fine as long as you work your way through these sections. One thing I would like to note is that I'm a big fan of reusing what you already have where possible, and I recommend utilizing links so you're not duplicating documentation in multiple places, because otherwise it kind of starts to kill the purpose of the whole thing and it's hard to maintain. The mission, vision, and purpose. If you don't have a mission, vision, or purpose, you'll need one. It sets the North Star for the rest of the organization and communicates that out to the business. Risk appetite. So as an example at EMC, we've got some enterprise risks, of which security maps into a couple of those. Do you have a risk register in place? We're looking for the big ones. This would be a place to understand that. Security objectives. Again, at a high level, this is one of those connect the dots exercises. What are some of the business outcomes you're hoping to achieve as a security organization? Maybe it's protecting brand reputation, protection of data, compliance with regulations. Think of things that have a direct impact on the broader business as a whole. Then map your security objectives, such as data protection, incident response, application security, to those higher level outcomes. Threat landscape assessment, anything that's an emerging threat to the organization in the form of legislation, technology. A recent example, generative AI, kind of that explosion brought out some new threats and potential legislation, so something that we wanted to track, but you want to note how you identify those new threats within your organization. The structure section, org charts, it's good to make one available. Especially in larger orgs. Does everyone know who is where in the world of hybrid and remote? That could be more important than you think. Cross-functional collaboration. I'm asking you not only to look at who the security organization collaborates with in terms of other departments, but also take notes on the effectiveness of that collaboration. Could it be better? Personnel allocation. This is kind of the next level down from the organization chart, but include some more detail, including open positions, contractors, any projections you might have in terms of staffing over the next 2 to 3 years. And then service catalog, capabilities, and RACI. What services do you offer? What capabilities do you have? You could use RACI charts. They can be effective with larger security orgs. We'll do a deeper dive into capabilities in the next section, though. The control section, policy standards and procedures. You want to evaluate existing security policies and ask yourself, are we missing anything? You'll find that that's kind of the first question that I ask in almost any one of these sections is it missing? The second question is it poor, and do you need to improve it? But the first one is always whether or not it's there, and always keep notes on this stuff. Compliance frameworks, do you purport to adhere to any security frameworks such as NIST or ISO? If you do, you'll want to make sure you have an up-to-date assessment of that adherence here. Security controls is about, first question, do you have a controls catalog? And second, if you do, how effective are the controls that are within it? And then finally, an incident response plan. I'm going to ask again, do you have one? If so, are you practiced in it? Do you have scenarios that are specific for testing? Assess the strengths and weaknesses of your IRP in this section. And then we move on to culture. And I'd say this section can get a little spicy, but I think it's important. In fact, it might be the most important subsection. You're evaluating your overall security culture here, which can really help inform what your strategy should be. So I remember a quote from Peter Drucker, who's a famous management consultant, who says that culture eats strategy for breakfast, and I believe that. And what he meant by that is no matter how great your strategy might be, your plan will fail if you don't have a culture in place that encourages people to actually execute it. So this section might inform you of some weak spots that will need tending to make your security program stick. So the first one I bring up here is security awareness. Do you have a training program? Do you do phishing testing? How good are your employees doing at that? And then when it comes to the spiciness, I'd say the leadership buy-in is probably one of those that you're going to want to document somewhere. How much work is it to convince executives, leadership, that security is important? The SSPF helps with it, but what does it look like right now? That's what we're really looking at with the current state on the environmental scan. And then behavioral norms. Think of things like hard-coded credentials, multi-factor authentication, local admin, the foundational things that can be so hard to get right. How receptive is your organization to actually making progress on these things? And then finally, resources. Another section that can get a little bit spicy because this is where we're assessing the strengths of our own team. Skills. Do you have the right mix of skills and expertise on your team to make the needed progress on your strategy? Budget and funding. As much as we would like to do all the things, it is just not possible. There is a limit. Make sure you understand what you have to ensure you're prioritizing the right things. Technology stack. There are so many tools that come in as suites these days. Do you have duplication in products and capabilities? How will you know if you don't keep them inventoried? It's high on the CIS top 18 for a reason. And then third-party relationships. This is more about security-specific third-party relationships. Your MSSPs, your pen test firms, your VARs. How good are those relationships and how much value are they adding? Breathe or take a drink. I'm going to at this point. Hopefully you are still with me. Environmental scanning, especially internal one, takes a lot of time. But if you don't lay the groundwork and truly understand what you have, your strategy will just plain suck. So, we're going into strategy formulation. Now we actually get to formulate a strategy, taking into account that environmental scan and the risk appetite that we talked about. Some of this will look like a little bit of repeat, but this is an iterative process. And where the internal scan was about understanding the environment, strategy formulation helps you make sense of it and prioritize it. Reviewing, updating the mission, vision, and purpose. I talked a little bit about this before, and I'm not going to go too deep into it, but do you have a mission? 2 to 3 sentences. Do you have a vision? This is kind of aspirational, looks a little bit like 3 to 5 years out, and frankly, 3 to 5 years is about as far as I will allow anyone to think out in this environment, and I think that might even be too far in some cases. And finally, a purpose. You can steal from the external environmental scan here, use that to build out the reason why your area exists at all. Objectives. They can be thought of in 2 parts. What you care about in the next year, and what are some of those long-term initiatives that you just can't get to right now, but you know you need to. Some examples that can fit into the objectives section: security roadmap for the upcoming year. If you have one, this is a good place to put it. Goals and OKRs. And without diving too deeply into what an OKR is, it's objective and key results, but think of critical initiatives that fall outside of your business as usual work or some of your project work. And then I also add the gaps identified through environmental scanning. So this kind of ties in the first section to the second section. And remember, I told you to take note of the gaps from that internal scan. This is where those gaps should live so you can assess their importance against the OKRs, against your goals, and against your roadmap they might have planned. And then finally, long-term technology adoption. I talked about some of the longer-term things that you might want to do, but understanding things like your licensing and gaps with current tool sets is crucial here. Are you looking to replace something in a couple of years, maybe add a new technology? This should prepare you for that so it's ready to go when you get there. Strategies for achieving objectives. So most larger orgs have adopted Agile in some form or fashion, but others may be using Waterfall. So that's how you do your work and how you'll want to link. You'll want to link to any work project tracking in this section, so you have a nice place to find it. But the section also serves 2 purposes, and it may be the most important piece of formulation when it comes to providing value. So the first one is, do you have role clarity within your team or department? You know, the RACI chart can help with that, but what services do you provide? Are they documented somewhere? Do you have a team overview page for the rest of the organization to understand what your team actually does? And then capability mapping, which is kind of my favorite piece. So this is where you really start to connect the dots between the work you do to the higher level business outcomes. It's kind of where you learn to speak exec. So I'll take a deeper look at the capability mapping through an example I created so you guys can all get a quick sample of what it looks like. So at its simplest form, there's just 2 levels to start with, and typically 3 to 4 levels in the end, depending on how ambitious you want to get. Capability mapping is something that I learned in grad school around assessing the core competencies of a business. So we would take a look at a company like UPS, for example, and figure out how the individual capabilities and resources mapped up all the way to delivering packages to customers. Like, what's the core competency of this organization? You can see how they all fit together and kind of start to see critical paths to how something gets executed. I'm taking that same approach here with security planning. In this example, you can see a set of security objectives up at the top. and a set of capabilities and services. So I took the liberty of getting some generic objectives, and you will use whatever you already have or create some that makes sense for your organization. I then take the services or capabilities that the teams offer and map them to a primary security objective. You could map them to multiple, and you feel free to do it if you want to, but it starts to lose a little bit of utility because it starts to look like a complete mess. I recommend starting with the primary mapping first, and feel free to get a start. I found that ChatGPT and some of the generative AI stuff really helps with mapping. It's fast. It's not always accurate, so you want to double check it. Copilot, whatever your disembodied friend of choice is, feel free to use them to help out. And I said there were 3 or 4 levels. The third level, which isn't pictured here but is on the next slide, are the business outcomes. What is important to the business, and how do our security objectives map into those? So at this level, you can, and I recommend that you do, add a few more mappings, but don't go crazy. You can go 2 instead of just 1 like I did in the other one. You can see it starts to get a little messy, and while my daughter is a graphic designer, she did not get any of those skills from me. I used some common business outcomes that an insurance company might want and mapped security objectives to those. Hopefully you can read them. They actually are colored on my screen, but that's okay. You can see, for example, that integrity and accountability are security objectives that map into the operational efficiency layer at the business outcome layer. So how does it look when it's bigger? Finally, I would say below the capabilities and services section is where you could map individual skills if you really want to get ambitious. This can get really granular, so do this last and only if it really brings value and you're kind of bored and you want to keep going. I didn't do that here. But once you finish, you can show your team now how their specific job actually maps all the way up to the higher level goals of the business. You can also use this as a way to communicate to the business. If you need a new role in your department, for example, say you discover through your environmental scan you're missing a capability or need to strengthen it, show where you'd fit it here and map it to a security objective that maps to a business outcome. Mapping is powerful. Too often I see security teams making arguments for why they need something in a way that just does not resonate. With management, this is a way to make the case. It's not all dollars and cents. There are business needs, which either leads to money or, in our cases, reduces the risk to losing money. And if you can demonstrate your understanding of that, you will get a lot farther faster. The last section on here, I won't spend too much time on, other than to say it's important, and it's policies and controls. If you notice any gaps with your policies and controls during your internal scan of them, this is where you'd want to prioritize those and figure out what needs to be created or changed within them. All right, now we're on strategy implementation. This is dealing with actually putting into action the things that you formulated after figuring out what you needed from the environmental scan. This involves translating the strategic plans into actionable tasks. Do you have the right things in place to execute the strategy that you've put together? Operational procedures is about the nuts and bolts of your work. Do you have a way to prioritize what needs to be done? How do you execute planned work? Do you have a documented approach to doing so and figuring out which work is more important than another? For example, fixing vulnerabilities or bugs versus planned project work. Is that documented somewhere that one is more important than the other? Do you have the right meeting cadence and communication strategy in place with your teams? Budgeting and financial. Planning for the costs associated with implementing security measures, including investments, personnel training, and infrastructure updates. Are we staying within budget? Have you allocated the right amount of funds? Maybe you have duplicate tool sets, like I mentioned earlier. There might be a way to save money there. And then finally, programs to promote performance. Sometimes there's bigger projects or efforts that go beyond the security organization team to execute, in fact, well beyond. Those are the big ones that are important to a large portion of the organization. We want to track those in a special place within the programs to promote performance, and those should be monitored. Finally, the checklist that I mentioned is the last part of the strategy implementation, so we make it front and center. Make sure you're just checking them off as you do them so that you can keep track of what's going on and follow that along. And the final section of the SSPF is around evaluating how well your strategies are being implemented. So we've got the evaluation and control section. Risk, performance, evaluation, and evolution. So risk and performance. At a high level, we're talking key risk indicators and key performance indicators, but there's a little more to it. Now I missed it. I made one mess up. Hold on, I need a drink for that. I could do an entirely new talk on risk, and I would love to do so sometime, but how to track that and communicate back to the organization. My preference for those who have worked with me and for me is to track individual findings at their most granular level and do that same kind of mapping exercise where I map them to the risk register at a detailed level and get them all the way up to a higher level that I can then share with executives and say, hey, this thing's important because we have this much risk here. Bubble them up and management can understand it. The performance section has more to do with measuring how well the strategy implementation went. So measure how responsive your teams are, how well they're developing their skills, and how well they've executed the plan for your strategy. Evaluation. Analyze the risk and performance metrics you've gathered, figure out if you're hitting the mark, identify areas of the strategy that may need improvement, and look for ways to show value. And then remember the first internal scan you did? So keep a history of that so you can demonstrate the increased maturity over time. If you just overwrite it, you're not going to be able to show executives just how much progress you made, so you want to make sure you keep that trending. And then evolution, carving out some time for what I'll call a strategy retro or strategy retrospective, doing this at least a couple times a year and using that as a catalyst for updating that internal snapshot for the environmental scan. That internal scanning section should be something that you can pull out and show someone as a relatively updated view of the security organization. So this matters to me. When I was putting this presentation together, I thought a lot about you, my audience here. So this framework should resonate pretty clearly with those who are in leadership positions within a security team, but it also applies to individual contributors as well. I thought back to that younger version of myself, the one who had just started out in my security journey, and I said, how would this be beneficial to that version of me? The answer to me is remember one of the key reasons that a business plan exists. What are they for? Laying out what your business is, how well it will work, and subsequently convincing someone to give you money. It's about influence, and you don't have to be a leader to have it. If there's one thing you gain from this presentation, it's that learning the language of your business and its leaders is key to convincing them that your ideas are good ones and that they should invest in your projects, in your technologies, in your skill development, and overall in you. Next steps. We're really, really close. I told you it wasn't fully baked. It's kind of sticky, like if I stuck one of those sticks into a muffin, it would pull out something. It's not quite baked yet. There's still a few kinks to work out, but on the whole, it's looking really good. I've created a personal GPT using ChatGPT and loaded the framework within it, which seems to open up a lot of possibilities. I found that GenAI can produce some really awesome results when it's built around a nice guided framework. So I'd like to create some common useful prompts for leaders and individual contributors alike to use for their own strategies they develop within the framework to make it even more actionable and easy to use. The modular design means each section and even subsections can answer specific questions that others may have of your program and strategy. For example, what does our program look like? What threats do we face? What's our current strategy? What frameworks do we align to? Each question could be answered by a section or subsection of the framework. And finally, at the last thing I'm going to say, I want to be ruthlessly simple in my communication strategy. The draw for something like this is to enable security teams to create strategies that could be consumed at all levels of an organization. To make that happen, the language needs to be easily understood. So thank you all. Hope you enjoyed.